Chair recognizes Senator from Connecticut.
Is the Senate in a quorum call?
We are.
I'd ask that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, a lot of Americans turned on the TV today hoping that the President of the United States was going to make a non-political, nonpartisan statement grieving the loss of those who died in that awful plane crash last night. Instead, he almost immediately launched into a political tirade, blaming what he called DEI. That accusation was echoed by the new Secretary of Transportation, the new Secretary of Defense. Apparently, the allegation is that by hiring non-white men at the FAA, this plane crash occurred. That's not true. That's offensive. It's not grounded in fact. It's just not accurate that by hiring women or black people or Hispanics that the safety of this nation is compromised. That's offensive. What we've just learned, though, is that the initial FAA report suggests that the tower staffing was not normal during the crash, that the controller on duty last night was doing a job traditionally handled by two people. There is supposed to be someone handling helicopter traffic and someone guiding planes into the airport. There was one person doing that job last night. We will learn more about what caused this crash. But it is not lost on us that the President of the United States made a choice when he came into office. He threw the FAA into immediate crisis. He ousted the administrator, replaced the administrator with no one, spent the first week trying to bully and intimidate federal employees. He fired the entire FAA Safety Advisory Board. So we will take the time to find out what actually happened. But this happened under President Trump's watch. Clearly something was not right in that tower last night. And it is important for us to follow the facts instead of making quick accusations. Mr. President, I came to the floor to continue the discussion that my colleagues have been having over the course of the last 2 days about something fundamentally dangerous that the President is engaged in, an attempt to seize power from Congress. I don't understand why my Republican colleagues aren't outraged by President Trump's announcement 2 days ago that he was suspending all federal spending. I don't know why my Republican colleagues don't see how that essentially makes us irrelevant. If we spend hundreds of hours of time engaged in very difficult bipartisan negotiations to come up with a federal budget every year, as is our constitutional responsibility under Article 1, and then the President of the United States decides to cancel all spending for weeks or months or longer. That's what the President did 2 days ago. Now, the courts have put a stay on that order, but the White House press secretary yesterday afternoon made it clear that they are still intending to pursue a shutdown of federal spending. And notwithstanding the very confusing set of news that came from the administration yesterday, notwithstanding the court order, my office has continued to be peppered with phone calls from organizations in Connecticut that are doing incredibly important work who can't get paid. One of our most critical homeless shelters called this morning to tell us that the disbursement system was still down. This is a homeless shelter that relies on federal dollars in order to pay the bills. Right now, they are potentially not going to be able to pay certain rents for their clients that are in emergency housing right now. They are facing an immediate cash flow issue. They'll be able to make payroll this week, but not next week. They still haven't been able to get paid by the federal government because their payment system was shut down. Yesterday, it's still not back up. Another not-for-profit in Connecticut that relies on federal funding to provide food for families and children that are having trouble putting a meal or two meals on the table, report that they are still not able to log on to get reimbursement. This is, again, a small not-for-profit that helps keep people alive with emergency food that does not have ample cash flow in their bank account, that is still unable to get federal reimbursement. The result of them shutting down or suspending operations is literally kids going hungry tomorrow, the day after that. The state of Connecticut has had a really important series of grants still suspended. Payments have been suspended to a federal grant that helps install solar and clean energy projects in Connecticut. That is not back up and running either. I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So nobody should think that this crisis has passed. Donald Trump suspended federal spending. The Medicaid system got turned off. Many other important payment systems got turned off. Some of them got turned back on after the order went into place or after it was clear that there was going to be a court order to stop the president from engaging in this unconstitutional action. But many of these federal programs are still suspended. There are literally people who may be tossed out on the street and become homeless. There are kids who may go hungry because this crisis has not been fixed. This is a fundamental corruption, what is happening right now. Because what Donald Trump will be able to do if he seizes control of federal spending from us is to be able to use his unilateral discretionary power to be able to send money to people that agree with him and deny it to people who don't agree with him, to send money to his billionaire friends' companies and to deny funding to the competitors of those companies, to decide that this disaster in a red state will get funding, but this disaster in a blue state won't get funding. And if you don't believe me, just look at the way that Donald Trump and Republicans are behaving right now about the wildfires in California. All of a sudden, Republicans are talking about applying conditions to saving people's lives and saving people's property in California. California is going to have to comply with an unknown set of conditions designed by Donald Trump and Republicans, conditions that were never even contemplated by Republicans when there was a hurricane in Louisiana or in Florida, when there were floods or devastating tornadoes in the Midwest. People aren't dumb. People know what's going on. There's a different standard if you are a friend of President Trump's than if you aren't. There's a different standard applied to aid that goes to states represented by Republicans than aid that goes to states represented by Democrats. And if we hand the unilateral decisions about where to spend money and where not to spend money to the chief executive, there's no going back. This is unconstitutional because the founders and the framers thought about this. We are Article 1, not Article 2, for a reason. We have the spending power for a reason. Our founding fathers were scared to death about the second coming of a monarchy. They were scared to death about putting too much power in the hands of the executive. So they said that Congress decides the big questions, where and how to spend money, the conditions applied to how that money is spent, whether or not the country goes to war or not. Those decisions are made by us, and when you hand them to any executive without check, it is a violation of the framers' intent, it is a violation of the letter of the law of the Constitution, and it is a recipe for corruption. And so I am angry that a lot of my Republican colleagues that I believe in, that I've worked with, that I've sat and negotiated tough bipartisan pieces of legislation, aren't raising alarm over what President Trump has done and what he is continuing to try to do. If you believe that this pause is good for 90 days, then I got a handful of bridges to sell you. If it's for projects in Democratic states or projects that don't align with the president's personal political priorities, I mean, nobody should believe that that pause is just going to last 90 days. This is a constitutional crisis. And yes, the courts have stepped in and put a stay on the president's order, but ultimately we should stand up for ourselves. We should stand up for congressional prerogatives, Democrats and Republicans. And what pains me even more is that my Republican colleagues don't see the story and the broader danger to our democracy, to our country, that is posed by the actions of this president in the first week. There were a small handful of my Republican friends who stood up and said it was wrong for Donald Trump to pardon the most violent of the January 6th rioters. Now, it was wrong for him to have pardoned any of the rioters, the people who sought to do violence to us. I hear a lot of Republicans claiming that, these were just tourists. Yeah, there were a couple bad apples in the bunch, but most everybody just kind of got pushed into the building by accident. They thought they were coming for a tour of the place. I was here that day. I don't remember a single one of my Republican colleagues staying in the chamber after we were told to flee to greet the tourists. Everybody knew that day that our lives were all in jeopardy, that they were looking for blood. One of the rioters, one of the most violent rioters, who beat police officers, who was let out of jail last week by Donald Trump, went to the scaffolding, the gallows, after he beat up police officers, and he posted on social media, "Too bad there aren't any Democrats hanging." I don't know why more of my Republican colleagues, and I thank Senator Grassley for speaking up on this, don't realize what happens when darkness descends on our agencies. I remember a time when Republicans believed in stewardship of the dollars that we appropriate, that we wanted to see what happened inside these agencies. Donald Trump fired all the inspectors general. Like, there are people, they're there for us, for the American people, to make sure that there's not thievery happening in these agencies. If you want to fire an inspector general, replace them with somebody better, fine. There's no inspectors general in our agencies. They're gone. And as far as I can tell, there's like one Republican that raised an objection to this. You put all of this together, the absolution of political violence, the darkening of operations in the executive branch through the firing of the inspectors general, and the seizure of spending power, that is all a recipe for despotism. And I understand that some people might think that that's hyperbolic, but I will just tell you that democracies do not die in an instant. Very few democracies that have perished have a day, a before and after moment. It's a descent, and then all of a sudden you wake up one day and you discover that you're not in a democracy any longer, that the leader, the president, has so much power that it can never be taken away. And the steps that have been taken by Donald Trump in the first week are a masterclass in the kind of plan that you would undertake if you wanted to grab power permanently. You say to your supporters, if you threaten or intimidate my opposition, I'll let you off the hook. You cast darkness over what happens inside the agencies so the president can move money any way that he wants without any accountability. And you seize control of spending so that you can use money to reward your friends and punish your enemies. One of the things that my Republican friends may not understand is what's happened since the January 6th pardons to Democrats. A lot of us don't talk about this because we frankly don't want to legitimize the people who are making the threats. But Mr. President, when Donald Trump's supporters are told that if they engage in violence in support of their president, that they will be let out of jail or face no consequences, they believe him. And so I will just tell you the calls and the threats that I have received since those pardons are serious. They have changed the way that I have to think about protecting my family. And I know that Republicans have received those threats over the years as well. I understand that these threats of violence do happen to both sides. But this is a specific immunity that has been given by Donald Trump. He has not given a broad immunity to people for beating up police officers. He gave pardons to a specific set of people who beat up police officers. If you are beating up police officers to further the political agenda of Donald Trump, you have immunity. And so all of a sudden, a lot of unhinged people out there believe that if they engage in violence to further Donald Trump's political ambitions, they have immunity too. Now, maybe at some point, they will believe that they are furthering Donald Trump's political ambitions by making threats against Republicans. But right now, the threats that they are lodging are against Democrats, especially those Democrats that have spoken up most vocally against the pardons of the violent January 6th rioters. And what happens when people start to feel those threats of violence, what happens when people worry about their safety if they engage in political action, is that they don't. What happens to organizations when they fear that they won't get a grant from the federal government if they don't pledge loyalty to the president, is that they don't speak up. Democracies don't die in a moment. They die when the rules get rigged so that there is a price to be paid, a bodily or financial price to be paid for standing up to the leader. That's what Donald Trump is constructing in his first week, a system of rules in which you as an American will pay a financial price or a physical price for criticism of the regime. That's not allowed in a democracy. And so I do not understand why we have been totally unable to find unanimity in two simple ideas. The President of the United States cannot, should not, excuse and encourage political violence. And that the President cannot and should not seize control of the spending power in this country to decide for himself which of us and which of our states get money and which of us and which of our states do not. Those are fundamental corruptions that make our country weaker, that destroy the democratic norms, that are existential to our sense of patriotism and Americanism, but also ultimately allow this administration to facilitate a kind of corruption that happens to almost every country that slides away from democracy, in which the leader, unbound, gets to reward friends around him who are loyal. So this crisis has not passed. As I said, there are organizations in my state that today cannot receive federal funds. A homeless shelter that is thinking about whether it's going to have to put people out on the street very soon if that funding portal doesn't get turned back on. But I'll leave you with this, Mr. President. I get it that today it feels like everything has to be partisan. Everything has to be us versus you. And I'll admit that I sometimes fall for that trap. We probably all of us sometimes fall for that trap of just evaluating everything based upon red versus blue. If the other side's for it, I have to be against it. I admit that I will fall for that trap sometimes. But I also, have my bona fides. I've sat down and negotiated with Republicans I disagree with on some really tough issues like guns and immigration and come to conclusions on those issues. So I've been willing to put my action where my mouth is and say, even on the tough stuff, we can find accommodation and agreement. But I don't know, I'm heartbroken. I'm heartbroken that more of my Republican colleagues didn't stand up and say, Mr. President, you shouldn't have pardoned the people who tried to kill us, the people who tried to steal the ballot box, the people who desecrated our Capitol. You shouldn't have pardoned them. I don't think that should have been so hard for us to agree on. It shouldn't have required courage for my Republican colleagues to stand up and say those pardons were wrong, Mr. President. And I don't think it should have taken courage yesterday for more Republicans to say you can't seize control of federal spending. It's not constitutional to cease paying people and paying nonprofits and paying for homeless services and paying for nutrition services. Well, you evaluate whether the programs line up with your political priorities. We passed a budget. We hammered out an agreement, a budget that has amounts and numbers, conditions on it. The president doesn't get to exercise independent authority. He has to implement the budget we pass. That weakens the institution. That weakens Republicans and Democrats. And I will guarantee you what comes around goes around. Sometime down the line, a Democratic president will do the same thing. We'll just suspend money for things that Republicans care about. I'll end up hurting you too. So I'm mad, I'm angry, I'm heartbroken, and I hope that this crisis will pass. But my belief is the only way that it passes. This crisis caused by the endorsement of political violence by this president, the shuttering of the inspectors general, and the seizure of spending power. I think the only way that this crisis passes, and it's a crisis, it's a constitutional crisis, is if we find a way to come together, Republicans and Democrats. That's not happening today. I hope as it happens tomorrow. I yield the floor.